Hello. Um, I work with Dan Utso at Dickinson Wright, and it is our pleasure to introduce Mark Fisher, who is the CEO of the Council for the Great Lakes Region. By way of a quick background, the Council was formed in 2011 as a binational organization. Its mission was to sort of enhance regional collaboration and cross-border integration by bringing together stakeholders from across all sectors to advance key issues to promote our environment and our economy. Mark has over 13 years experience in policy making, public policy advocacy, and business strategy, with a particular emphasis on U.S.-Canada relations. I think he's going to share some of the cool things that are going on in the Great Lakes region related to energy and economic development. Dickinson Wright is very supportive of Mark and the Council, and we're excited to have him here. Mark?
Well, thanks for that kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think some people have darted out for coffee, and I don't blame them. It's been a great program with lots of fantastic ideas and discussion. So the Council of the Great Lakes Region, what is the Council? We were formally launched in 2013, but the idea of the Council actually stems back to 2011. And it really grew out of a body of work that was being undertaken at the time by the Brookings Institution with John Austin, who a lot of people of you probably know, and the Mowat Center for Public Policy out of the University of Toronto. And their research really looked at and delved into how we collaborate in the region across the border and across key sectors when we think about the economy, when we think about the environment. And at the summit that they hosted in 2011, which brought together leaders from around the region, government, state, provincial, federal, local, private industry, academia, many of the nonprofit sector groups that are here, Council of Great Lakes Industries, Can-Am BTA, governors and premiers, to really talk about how the mechanics of collaboration. And one of the big conclusions that came out of the event was that while we do a pretty good job on the environment side in terms of cooperation on a number of key issues, and that's principally because we have the historical architecture to allow that to happen, whether it's through the International Joint Commission and the Boundary Waters Treaty, Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. There are no shortage of treaties and agreements and frameworks on the environment side that have really driven this collaboration over, I'd say, 100+ years. On the economic side, I think leaders firmly believed coming out of the summit that there was a fairly large gap when it comes to how we think about and collaborate on economic issues in a region like this, which spans 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and 8 states, New York to Minnesota. And as a result of that, many people brighter than I put their heads together to think about an organization that could really try and fill that gap. And so soon after the forum, the summit, Canada's former ambassador to Washington, Gary Dewar, and former U.S. ambassador David Jacobson, together with Laura Dawson, I think, who's jumped out for coffees now, Woodrow Wilson Center, thought about that kind of organization that could fill that gap. And they very quickly turned out west for inspiration and looked at an organization called the Pacific Northwestern Economic Region, which has been around for about 25+ years now. And that organization has been a real catalyst and a driver of relationships between government, the private sector, academia, in really thinking about the Pacific Northwestern Economic Region as a shared binational economic region. And how do you bring all of these different voices and organizations and interests together in one place at one time to try and think about region-wide strategies to some of these big issues that are facing the region, and really trying to take the border out of the equation. And so ultimately, in creating the Council of the Great Lakes Region in 2013, that's the model that we've tried to put in place. And so for us, when you look at the Great Lakes economy, our main mission is obviously, first and foremost, how do you deepen the U.S.-Canada relationship in a region like this? So how do you take it from the national level to a regional level? And in addition to that, and I think this is our most important aim, is how do we create a more dynamic and stronger culture of collaboration and harnessing the region's economic strengths. And there's reason to do that. It's a $5.8 trillion economy. That's US dollars. That would be the third largest economy in the world in GDP terms if it was a country, just behind the United States and China. It's a massive economy. Roughly 50% of the total value of imports and exports between the two countries happened through the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence region. So a tremendous amount of commerce and freight going back and forth across the border. The region is responsible for roughly a third of the combined American and Canadian labor force. In addition to that, and I don't know if Wendy had to leave. I loved her innovation presentation. The region is responsible for roughly 24% and 72% of U.S. and Canadian R&D funding, respectively, 26% and 68% of patents in the U.S. and Canada, and is responsible for roughly 47% of university graduates. So in terms of the hard numbers, in terms of the volume of trade that's going across the border, in terms of the research that's happening here, the talent that exists here, I don't think you will find a more important and strategic trade corridor that exists between the two countries. And increasingly, it's becoming a global and continental gateway for both countries. And so for us, when we think about the future, and many people this morning touched on the issues that we are interested in as well. For us, it's how do you bring people together to really think about new ways of again, harnessing the region's economic strength. So when we look at transportation, for example, in the region, and we've got some of the world's top ports, airports, an expansive network of rail and road and pipelines, how do we think about that transportation network as an ecosystem, as a built ecosystem? And ultimately, how do we look at how we move freight and people? How do we optimize the performance of that system? I know Peter Johnson is here from the governors and premiers. They released this morning their maritime strategy. I think that's a great start to this conversation. But there's also a bigger picture there in terms of, how do we link in the maritime component to our other modes and our assets, and thinking about how do we optimize this economic platform as a region. We are also looking at issues from a regulatory standpoint. So everybody's probably familiar with the Regulatory Cooperation Council at the federal level. One of the things that we're interested in doing as an organization is that state-provincial conversation with private industry and looking at some of those regulatory issues that exist at the state-provincial level that sometimes create barriers to trade across the border as well. Infrastructure renewal. Like I said before, it's a $5.8 trillion economic platform. This economy would not work without infrastructure. But it's aging infrastructure. And so when you look at the conversation about investment in renewing and building new infrastructure, particularly trade-enabling infrastructure, at a time where I think most governments in the region are struggling in terms of public debt and reinvesting in infrastructure, how do you bring the private sector to the table and leverage their know-how and their capital in addressing some of the infrastructure challenges we have? Workforce development and mobility. We talked a little bit about certification and standards and accreditation. How do we look at the shortages that we're going to see in this region in terms of shortfalls in the labor market and do a better job of sharing talent across the border? There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that. Border management goes without saying. This region is extremely important economically. It needs to function more seamlessly in terms of the border, and we've been working with a number of groups, including Jim Phillips' group at CanMBTA on the new multimodal pre-clearance agreement, and hopefully when that is enacted, we will start to see progression in terms of being able to put in the legal frameworks that will allow for the freer movement of goods, but more importantly, people. Innovation is obviously an increasingly important topic for our council and for the region. I think when you've looked at the success of the economy, It is largely built on the second and third industrial revolution, heavy manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing, and we're seeing a massive shift in that industry right now that is being driven by advanced manufacturing and the integration of technology into our manufacturing sector. But we're also seeing the role that technology can play across the services sectors that exist in the region. And so we're trying to drive that new conversation in terms of how the region can lead and participate in what I call the digital economy. And so how do you look at the disruptive technologies and be a leader in not only creating that technology, but how do you incorporate that into everything you do in terms of the services sector, manufacturing, government, and be a leader in driving that conversation. And so looking at developing a digital vision and strategy for the region that incorporates where we need to be competitive in the fourth industrial revolution. And then just to close on energy, I think increasingly as we talk about the challenge of climate change and how we're going to grapple with that over the coming decades, we have a tremendous amount of resources in the region. Lots of oil and gas is shipped through the region. Some of it's developed in the region. We have a significant amount of hydro and nuclear capacity in the region. We have growing diversity in terms of the renewable supply mix. But we don't necessarily have the right policy framework or regulatory framework that allows us to share those energy resources. And so for us as an organization, taking a cue from the U.S. Department of Energy's first quadrennial energy review, is what can we do as a region in creating more of that regional marketplace that allows us to do a better job of understanding the energy market that we have in the region, but also doing a better job of sharing those resources across the border as we think about shifting to that low-carbon economy. So as you can see, there are no shortage of big issues that we need to tackle to really do what we were set up to do as an organization, which is ultimately build our competitiveness, our prosperity, and find new ways of harnessing our economic strengths. And as a nonprofit organization, we can't do that without the support of many partners from government, private sector, and academia. So just as a final pitch, if you're not a member, become a member. We need your support with respect to the public policy research we want to do on the issues I talked about. Become involved in our events like the Great Lakes Economic Forum, which we just hosted in Toronto. We'll be hosting the next one in Detroit next year. It's a great opportunity to put a lot of these regional issues on the agenda and to drive collaboration across the border and particularly between sectors, and also get involved with the advocacy that we've been doing. I think pre-clearance is a great example in terms of how organizations like the Council of the Great Lakes Region, CanMBTA, and other groups can actually come together and develop a stronger voice in Washington and in Ottawa on these very important issues, and making sure that that we see advancement in the policy agenda. And with that, I'll introduce Lori, who's got a great story to tell when it comes to renewable energy in Ohio and in the Great Lakes region. I don't have his full bio here, but I'm sure he'll give you a brief introduction of himself and the great work that he's been doing in the renewable space. So with that, over to you, Lori.
Take this out. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I want to tell you that little pitch for him. I went to that summit, and it was pretty amazing. And one of the reasons I went is because really here in Ohio, especially us in Cleveland and on the lake, are married to Canada. We have one of the few shared resources in the Great Lakes. So while we think in Ohio it's our lake, the Canadians think it's their lake, and the best way to do that, for example, on the fisheries, and the people that were there and the collaboration on the industry. So that was a tremendous way to understand how our project and what we're doing impacts our relationship. Just to give you a little bit of idea, a brief bio of me. I started out as a nuclear engineer working on nuclear fusion. It was only 10 years away and we were already designing power plants. Today nuclear fusion is, I don't know, maybe only 50 years away. So I moved to something a little more challenging, offshore wind. And we have a presentation that I can talk to you about. There's somebody here. There we go. Okay, so when the Canadians get up in the morning on the other side of Lake Erie, this is what they see. Does anybody know what city that is? No, that's Cleveland, man. Cleveland rocks, okay? So this is the north coast of the United States, and this is what it looks like about 7-8 miles out in the lake. We were doing some geotechnical work in 2013. That was some gear that we brought over from Lake Michigan. And it just gives you an idea of what this north coast of this state looks like in our shared resource with Canada. Now, we have worked with the Canadians over the years, both on technical. They have some great maritime activities, McKeel Marine in Hamilton. At one time, Ontario had a very broad offshore program in wind. They wanted to take their superlative success from on land and go offshore. Became a bit of a political challenge, so in 2011, right before the election, a moratorium was put in place. And so since then, we've collaborated with some of the developers up there. Our turbine manufacturer makes a few components in Ontario, so we'll see where that goes. I have the clicker, we have the technology. Okay, a little bit about who we are, and an interesting hybrid. We're a public-private corporation. We're the counties along the lakefront of Ohio. And for those of you that are not familiar with the way Ohio works and the Great Lakes, each state owns the waters of the Great Lakes under similar mechanisms, but they're all somewhat different. And in Ohio, the counties are the jurisdictional entity that can lease the lake bottom in conjunction with the state. So the county says, yeah, we will approach the state for a lease, and then the state actually grants the lease typically it's been for docks and breakwalls and things like that, water intake cribs. So our partners in the public sector are the counties of Lorain, Cuyahoga Lake, Ashtabula, and this past year Erie County joined us, so we are a multi-state organization. And then we also have the City of Cleveland and the Cleveland Foundation. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Cleveland Foundation, it's the world's oldest community foundation, founded here in Ohio. The great industrial revolution of the early 1900s produced a lot of wealth. And so the Cleveland Foundation has been around for 102 years, has given away over $2 billion to the local communities. And the interesting thing about that story is that in 2004, they looked at what was going on in Ohio, and they said, you know, we give to arts, we give to education, we give to social services. We really need to think about what's going on the economic development side. And then we need to, as another speaker said from probably that famous Canadian hockey player about trying to figure out where the puck is and going there instead of, or where the puck's going to be instead of going where it is, because by the time you get there, it's too late. And the idea was energy, which today, you know, it seems like a no-brainer, but in 2004, there were a lot of people that said, what do you mean energy is the next big thing? Long story short, offshore wind is something that really plays to the skill set in the Midwest, in particular in Ohio. And that's why we were organized, to create the economic prosperity. In many ways, in the northeast part of Ohio, and we have some real challenges on the environmental side. And the goal is to cut our own path and help clean the environment through our own efforts. So that was really our purpose. We started out to try and attract private funding. We did, and then a very large corporation decided it was too hard, and so they left. And so we morphed into the development role. We have become the developer, and during that period of time, we've attracted private funding from the Cleveland Foundation, grants. We attracted a private developer that has put private money into the project, opened up a headquarters in Cleveland, Ohio, their U.S. headquarters, and we've attracted over $50 million from the federal government, from the Department of Energy, to the region, which will be leveraged to create $160 million in gross regional product over the life of the project. Okay, so why are we doing this? You're going like, yeah, why not just build it on land? Well, that's a long story. We don't have enough time, but let's look at it this way. This is what's going on in Europe. Try technology here. Come on. Okay. So there are over 80 offshore wind farms in Europe. Put it another way, over $160 billion of investment between today and 2020. So if I walked up to any one of you and said, you know, there's this group of people in Europe called Europeans, built an industry that has $160 billion of investment, mostly from private. Wouldn't that be something you'd want to take a look at and go, maybe we can do it here? Of course, in Cleveland, we are a little bold. We invented wind energy in 1887 with Charles Brush, first electric wind turbine. We invented the modern wind turbine at NASA Lewis, which you heard about earlier, which is now NASA Glenn. So put in other numbers, there's more than 82 offshore winds, 4,000 wind turbines, 12,000 megawatts. What does that mean? That's kind of the equivalent of 12 nuke plants. And this is just the beginning of the industry. Now, from day one, we always said we want to build a demonstration project in Lake Erie. Build it so small that we can learn what we have to learn, but no matter under any circumstances, would it have an impact on the environment? We already know today from the large offshore wind farms in Europe that most of the effects are very beneficial to the environment, but you always want to start small. Just like in any industrial facility, you have a process, you're going to do something new, you build a small pilot facility, you learn what you know, you learn what you don't know, and you go forward. We have been working with the state of Ohio since 2008 to figure out how to do this right from an environmental standpoint, right from an economic development standpoint. So just a few facts. That's the Lake Road substation, an old coal power plant from the, I think actually from the 20s. This is the underwater cable, and then these are the 6 turbines. The reason there's a 7th one out there is we simply did, when we did our geotech campaign, we investigated another site in case we needed to move one of the turbines. This is the water intake crib, which is about 3.5 miles out. That was built in 1904 by the Cleveland Water Department, large steel and concrete structure, and our first turbine is about 8 miles out. This is one of my favorite ones. When these coal and nuclear power plants were built anywhere from 100 years ago coming forward, they formed one of the greatest grids in the country, and in many cases, people refer this to as the Lake Erie connector. For those of you that remember the 2003 outage, it was a little tree right around here that kind of caused the whole loop to come crashing down. But be that as it may, many of these are the ISO lines showing the distance out from all the power plants along the lakeshore. And in fact, many of these are old coal plants that have been decommissioned, but their grid infrastructure is still there. So the point of this slide is simply to say is that this will help us become competitive because much of the infrastructure is already in place. This gives you an idea of what we did last summer. We went out. This is a collaboration, and you can see the different participants to go in and measure really with a microscope everything that's going on at the lake bottom so we can build the foundations. This is the foundation that we have developed with our Danish partner. It's basically a skirt, a lid, and a shaft. It's called a mono bucket. In the oil and gas industry, it's termed a suction bucket. Why is that? Well, it's really pretty cool, very basic. You place it on the lake bottom, you suck the water out, the structure sucks itself down into the soil. It's noiseless, it doesn't disturb the environment, and once it's embedded in the soil, it captures all of that soil and acts like a large gravity base. So essentially, this foundation contains 3,000 tons of soil to hold it in place. This is really one of the keys that we've looked at. We have designed this from day one to be manufactured in the U.S. To date, all of them have been manufactured in Europe. We wanted to bring this home. It also is the most cost-effective foundation for any of the projects in the Atlantic that are under 50 meters of water. To show you what we needed to do to get there, we developed with our team, and you can go through this and see the steps, but essentially we did individual visits from the designer to the manufacturer's facilities, pre-qualified them, look at all their quality specifications, see if they could handle the role of the material. For example, these foundations weigh about 400 tons. And eventually, we visited 10 different U.S. manufacturers. Now, we would hope that all 10 would have been in Ohio, but we lucked out. We did pretty well. As it turns out, there are 5 manufacturers on the short list, and 4 of them are in the Great Lakes region. So I think from just a general standpoint, it speaks to what our capabilities are in this region when it comes to big metal, heavy steel, and being able to take an engineered product and then industrialize it. This is the quiet and gentle foundation, as I say. This is an actual installation in the North Sea. We have a video if any of you would like to see it. But basically, this is going down into the soil. It goes about 1 centimeter per minute, so pretty slow. And there's George and his friends just sitting there watching it go down and, living their life and not being bothered by it. The first question we always get is, what are you going to do about the ice? Well, really, the ice is no different than the 100-foot waves in the North Sea. In Lake Erie, the largest sustained wave is about 24 feet. Of course, there's been peaks. So we designed to a 24-foot wave. In the North Sea, they design for 100-foot waves. In the lakes, we get something called ice. This is just to show you an example of a wind turbine in Finland in icing conditions every year than what are greater in Lake Erie historically. And we decided this would be a good person to bring on our team. So Aranti Engineering did our ice engineering along with DNV and a couple of other folks. As I said earlier, we brought in a private partner. Fred Olsen Renewables is the largest independent power producer in Europe, a non-utility. They're a multinational company, been around since 1848. And they formed a U.S. subsidiary in Cleveland, Fred Olsen Renewables USA, and they will become the builder, owner, and operator of the project. The other thing is there's another company called Fred Olsen Wind Carrier, which is in our estimation, of course, the premier installation contractor. And why do I say that? Used to take 2 weeks to put up an offshore turbine. They figured out how to do it in 8 hours, which on land is even a challenge. So they can go out to a foundation, put the entire turbine up in 8 hours. The other thing is that 0 lost time injuries over the course of this. In their crew transfer vessels, they have something like 340,000 man hours, 0 lost time injuries. That's the kind of partner you want to be with so they can help you build an industry and build it safely. Yeah, people ask about the public. This is just an interesting slide that we love to show. We went to visit 21,000 homes. We talked to 15,000 of them in the region, every little blurb there. And 92% said they were in favor of this project. We said, well, if you're so in favor of this project, would you pay more in your electrical bill? And if you would, how much would you pay? And this was really a market survey. It was a way to gauge the, it's easy to sign a petition. It's easy to say, yeah, I love it. Okay, where's your money? So 60% said they would pay at least 10 to 15% more per month. And this is what helped us sell the power, is we could demonstrate to the utilities that by and large, most of the public is very much in favor of a very small project like this that can help give us an entree into the future. Yeah, I mentioned this before. Minor detail, we brought $50.7 million to Ohio, which is one of the largest federal grants ever received in the state, at least in recent times. And we're incredibly proud of that. This is to build the project, one of 3 demo projects awarded in the country. And spin long and prosper. That's a photo sim of what the turbines will look like on a very clear day. As you can see, when you're 8 miles out, things get pretty small. So thank you very much.